everyone. My name is Bahano Nasia from Wonderland, and I'm so happy to have Baptist in a new webinar of tracts. Hi, Baptist. Would you tell us a bit about you? Introduce yourself to our audience.
Great. Thank you, Banu. My name is Baptist Coelho, and I'm an artist from India. And I'm currently based between Paris and Ypres in Belgium. And I work with different mediums like installations, videos, performances, drawings, etc. And at this moment, I've been researching on the history of Indian soldiers during the World Wars. And my work is research based, and I work with various mediums, and um, the mediums are really something, it's like a manifestation of all that research. But the most important part for me is also the journey, the research, the findings, and then the sort of developing them into artworks. Yeah.
Thank you. It's such an interesting topic, which I personally was not aware. I mean, when I was in Gallipoli, for instance, about the First World War memorials and so on, that was the first time where I noticed that there were actual people from New Zealand or Australia fighting in the gays. And I was not aware of Indians fighting in the World War in Europe or so. So you are tracking the traces of Indian soldiers. Can
Yes.
you introduce us a little bit? I completely blank in this.
Yes, it's actually a topic that has been not so well, even back home and yeah, back home in India. In my history books, we didn't really have so much of information about this particular past because India was part of the Indian armies worked for the British colonial forces. It wasn't a war of India or any other colonial countries. They were sort of dragged in, and they were mostly used as cannon fodder, as we call it. It was and India supported the British and other colonial forces, not just with arms, but with money, with cattle, with guns and machines and etc. and tracks and tankers etc. So there was a lot of investment by the Indians in World War One and World War Two, and it is something that I also wasn't really aware. I didn't grow up with this idea simply because born in Mumbai, and so there's no sort of history of my family in the armed forces, etc. And it was really by chance that I saw some Indian soldiers somewhere in a display in a British museum that started off this particular inquiry somewhere as not so recent. It was in 2010, 11. That's when I sort of started to really try to understand and try to see what was this particular history and why wasn't it really, so why isn't that particular history really sort of not really not being taught or not being sort of exposed back home in India and also worldwide. But yes, in the recent years there has been a lot of interest, a lot of researchers in India and outside the country have been trying to, sort of look at these archives and these archives are in various museums in various locations in India, abroad. So, and that became then an interest to really talk about talk about the subaltern, the one, the soldier that couldn't really have a voice during that time and trying to understand their stories. Yeah.
Would you like to share a little bit what you found out or what the current state of your research is? Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
I'm really curious.
Well, so at this point of time, I've just put a little small sort of introduction into my research that has specifically got to do with the Indian prisoners of war. So I've been looking at the subject in 360 point of view, from the points of view in France, from the points of view in Belgium, because the Indian soldiers had presence all across Europe and also other parts of the world and in India itself. But in this particular presentation, I focused just mainly on the Indian prisoners of war that were taken by the Germans and they were put somewhere outside camps outside Berlin. Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen. Um,
Let's hope the technology works with us.
yeah,
Looks already very good. Yes, wonderful.
Perfect. So I call this presentation What the Tongue Remembers, Traces, Absence, and Embodied Archives. It is a bit worded, yes, but at the same time, it's really something which really struck me throughout this particular segment, to do something with the tongue. And it's not something that I had encountered across my other sort of, that I've been researching. So let's go. So what happens over here is that I was revisiting the experiences of around almost 1,000 soldiers from the Indian Army who fought for the British during the First World War. And these soldiers were captured on the Western Front in France and Belgium. And then they were sent to a prisoner of war camps at Zossen and Wunstorf near Berlin in Germany. And the way I research, I prefer to go in a very sort of a 360-degree approach. And so for this particular research in Berlin, I was looking at these sound archives, and which include voice recordings, and also looking at photographs, leaflets, drawings, paintings, film clips, and something called the paletograms. And the paletograms is something that really caught my attention. Something which I didn't really knew that existed until I stumbled upon some text in the books, and that's when I was very curious. So just to give you an idea, the sound archives is created into two parts, and it's called the Laut Archive, and then you got something called the Berlin Phonogram Archive, and they both exist inside the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. And these recordings were conducted by various German officials in war camps, where colonial soldiers were made to speak into an Edison phonogram that you see over here on the right hand side. Uh, in the Laut archive, you have something called the shellac records, and on your left, you see this black plate, and this is one of the depositories in the Laut archive, which is in the Humboldt Forum. And on these shellac records is where you find some of the Indian soldiers' voices. Now, this was a very interesting image that Christopher Lee, who is the collection manager of the Laut archive, shared, and these are very interesting, detailed views of the shellac records. Very interesting also to look at them and to see how these particular stories, how these voice recordings were sort of made, and what were the soldiers recording, and what they could not say, and what could they say. Uh, so I'm giving you a little bit of an overview. So in the Humboldt Forum, you've got this fantastic display of very interesting musical instruments, and was very interesting how music was also part of the recording. Soldiers would sing songs and play sometimes instruments. And so I was looking at also music, and the whole world of the sonic, how does sonic archives work in this case? And in this case, the object that creates the music, and in this case, these particular instruments was very interesting. This particular broken Indian instrument that I found, it was something that was damaged during Second World War, and then it was reconstructed in a computer. And so this is one of the other very interesting Indian instruments called the veena. Now, across these archives, what was very interesting, apart from the sound archives, there were also drawings that some of the soldiers had made. And here you see a colored drawing showing the Indian goddess Saraswati, and these were made by the prisoner of war camps, the Indian soldiers. And so looking at these archives, we go into something called the wax cylinders, where these recordings are sort of, they are recorded on to these particular cylinders as such. And what's very interesting is to see what was the sort of the way in which it was recorded, the way in which Indian soldiers were sort of, were asked to sort of stand and then to sort of make these recordings into the phonogram. And over here you see something called, I'll just give you a little. So in these instruments, in these recordings, there were also recordings of musical instruments like the drum and the tabla, as we call it. Not completely clear, but sort of very in this very sort of raw format. And maybe I can try to sort of share one of these one of these. So that was just an idea to just to give you a sense of how uh, this particular record.
Baptist, can you understand what he was singing?
So at this point, this particular recording, not really.
Hmm. Because for us, it was also this blurry. It almost sounded like one can understand the text. Obviously, I don't speak the language, but it felt like maybe it's even a common known melody. So that was the reason why I wanted to ask if you
Yes.
can relate.
Yes, somehow. So some of these, so they spoke in Hindi, Urdu, Gurmukhi, and the way these recordings were done. Some recordings I do understand hints and bits and pieces, but most of them in Gurmukhi I don't speak, and I also don't speak Urdu or understand Urdu. So it's a bit difficult. But yes, some of them, like some of them are actually talking about tales, folk tales and something like a character called Sheikh Chili, and I know these tales, and so somehow I could piece it in my head. The when they speak in Hindi, again the Hindi, you have different accents, different dialects, different pronunciation. So and again the recordings are so rough, it is a bit difficult, and to sort of if I have to really get into it, yes, I can, I'll have to sit down with a pen and then like transcribe it, yes. But otherwise, most of them, it's quite difficult. Also because of the quality of the recording, they were done in this very raw format, and so even the digital, what you hear, I'm playing is a digital format, so it's a bit rusty. But yes, the idea is to actually sort of transcribe some of them. I'm in the process actually of doing them because some of them I want to basically develop them into some forms. Yeah, because especially the one where he talks about this Sheikh Chili. He was supposed to be a very clever, but also a very clever person, but at the same time, he had his traits, and I was trying to understand what the soldier is trying to say. So, yes, there is an idea to transcribe them and to further make them into some sort of a form to then so it becomes accessible to a larger audience. Yeah. So over here, do you see is this particular photograph, uh, and it is supposed to be something called a spring festival where Indian soldiers were dressing up, were playing dress up with like playing costumes, and they were putting on clothes that would basically resemble something that was from India. And what's very interesting to observe is that there is this particular character who is dressed in this sari, which is an Indian garment, which is mostly worn by females. And it's interesting over here, you see this character on the left standing. And what's very quirky is, what's very interesting for me, I noticed was in the sari, there is usually in a sari at the border, there's always some kind of a shining embroidery part. And over here, you notice that instead of course, it is not an actual sari. So he's put some kind of foil. And if you look at the dates, foil was invented by then. So it's very interesting how he makes this makeshift sort of, trying to make this border and trying to enhance the sari and give it this particular feeling of what the sari is. And I'm trying to read it into these details. What were they trying to say? Does this suggest something? Because you have to understand the soldiers really couldn't say or do anything out of hand. They were prisoners, so they were actually it was a prison. So it's very interesting for me to observe. So I'm also looking at the sari here, looking at the details, and trying to really dissect the images over here. Uh, What's also very interesting is over here, then there was a propaganda book that was created by the camp commander called Otto Steele over here on your left, you see. because what they were trying to do is in the camps itself, they actually created a Muslim soldiers camp, and they were trying to also groom them in such a way that they also went on to create a mosque, a wooden mosque in the middle of outside Berlin. So that is also very interesting to observe. So in my research, there was these books I was going through, and in this, you see, there was a particular book that I had found by Shantanu Das, who's a historian, British, Indian-born British historian at Oxford, and he notes about he mentions something like this, like along these recordings, palaetograms were made to determine tongue position and pronunciation. And I never came across this term anywhere across my research. And I went out and reached out to him and I said, did you really see these palaetograms? And he said, it's been a while. I didn't really see it, but somewhere it was mentioned, but I didn't actually see the actual palaetograms. And then that became sort of an interest point for me because what has happened is that we've had some researchers, some artists and scholars who have touched upon this research. And whenever I'm trying to research, I try to see what can I add to this archive, what can I bring in more to this particular table. And somehow the palaetograms became something very interesting because somehow uh, no one had seen them. And even the word palaetogram, I tried to even understand what does it mean and what, etc. And I tried to there was no sort of visual evidence also within the archive. So what I did was I tried to find something online, and then I came across this particular video, where you see someone actually putting paint into someone's tongue, and then, as you can observe, uh, so this is what would have been done to the Indian soldiers, and then he would say a word, and then you see there's an impression inside. Do you see that little block on the palate? So that impression was used then on a paper. It was taken on a piece of paper, and it was a way to understand linguistic study. It was part of linguistic studies, and it was also a very sort of, I would say, also a very invasive, uh, technique, I would say. So, but we don't really have any kind of, evidence of these palaetograms. So at the same time, there was also this thing, did they really exist? So within my research, we went to the archives, and one of Will, Albrecht, who was one of the archivists at the Phonogram Archive, he found this very interesting document, which is a kind of invoice. And he says, Baptist, here there is a mention of the palaetogram. So yes, they did exist, because there is this idea, did they really exist? So then we find that there is some sort of an invoice, and there's a mention of the word palaetograms. Uh, and then I went on to try and find it. I went and tried to look at different institutes across Berlin, because you have to understand a lot of material was moved around after the Berlin Wall. Archives from A went to B, B went to C, C went to D. Within all that, I found someone reached out to me called Franka Schneider, and she says that in 2021, when she was an independent curator at one of the organizations, she was conducting some research, and she was collecting something to do something with a German exhibit at the Humboldt Labor, and she found a box, and she says in this box there were a lot of these images. They were like these polaroids of skulls, etc. And we think that somewhere inside this box there could have been the palaetograms. And I tried to reach out to find where this box is, but it was difficult. I was going from one wall to the other wall, something like that. And it's also interesting to know that why did this get lost, or was it strategically taken out, or what, or they destroyed, because there's also something to do with the fragility of this material. So it's really interesting to understand when archives, when there's a trace, but there is no evidence to prove or something of that sort. Because I did face this kind of questions from historians during my research, but we don't have the proof. So how does it exist? But there's a mention as an invoice. So that was interesting. So within my research, then I went into finding something at the National Library, the library in Berlin. And here is very interesting. So there was a man called William Durgin, who was a camp organizer who was one of the camp leaders. And his brother was a dentist, and his brother's called Alfred Durgin. And within the dentistry system, realm of things, I found something like a microfiche, and in this there is a mention of the paletograms. So yeah, so this is very, so we are trying to make, so kind of sort of join the dots between William Durgin and then his brother Alfred Durgin, and then we see these impressions. They are not the impressions of the Indian soldiers, but they give us an idea that basically they were done at some point. And what does it mean? What does it mean to create a trace of the tongue? And in this case, the tongue, how does it, what can it say, what can it not say, etc., etc. So within that research, so this is the paletograms, and this is what you see, the microfiche that I was basically seeing at the library. And within that, I went also to Wunstorf, and in Wunstorf, I noticed there was this museum called the Garrison Museum, and the exact word is something in German. I'm not able to pronounce it, but this was a very interesting, small little museum. It was a very local museum, and inside this museum, they have fantastic images, postcards which have got Indian soldiers on them, and these were distributed in war times. And it's also very interesting to see the writing behind these particular postcards. I've not yet started to sort of translate, but there's an idea to basically translate some and to see whether there was any referencing made by German locals about these Indian soldiers, or were they just as imagery. But I also consider these postcards across my research, not only in Germany, but in France, Belgium. They were like the Instagram during World War One. That was the way people saw what was happening, what was not happening, and how were they presented, how were these soldiers presented from another world, from another country. Um, Very interesting text that is happening behind these postcards. And then this is a very interesting image. This is an inside view of one of the inside the barracks of the Indian soldiers, because he had created different clusters of Indian soldiers, Muslim soldiers within this particular prisoner of war camps. This is again is a very interesting image on your right. You can see like local people were then coming to see these Indian prisoner of war. And I might even, who are these people from another land? And if you see this image there's a bit like a buffer space in between, and there's a barbed wire. Something that was, I think, also in the spirit of the human zoo, I would call it. So that was again another image that I see, and this is something I never knew until I went and saw it in this particular small little museum. In this museum, I noticed then there were images of these graves and of these Indian soldiers, because in Berlin itself, outside there is actually a grave of soldiers called the Zend of Indian Cemetery that is managed by the Commonwealth Graves Association. These are the very interesting cemetery, the tombstones of Indian soldiers just outside Berlin. This particular cemetery was completely lost in time. It was completely, nobody knew of its existence until they found like these metal tracks underneath to held up that held the tombstones, and that's when the Commonwealth recreated this sort of, they put these tombstones on. So this what you see today is not something that was there like that. It was completely a ruin because there was a Russian occupation, there was this, there was that. That place saw many changes. Um, and I will end with this particular little detail, what was very interesting for me, is that there was a Muslim mosque. So there was a mosque that was built for these particular Indian prisoner of war. And I went and tried to look where this mosque is today. And the mosque is on a street called Moshe Strasse. And I went there outside Berlin, and it was, of course, it's not there, but what was very interesting was in this place today is actually it's actually something called a initial reception facility for refugees and asylum seekers. It's exactly on this particular land that was once upon a time the prisoner where the mosque stood. And the idea is to sort of try and see if I can try and sort of build a narrative between these two histories of these Indian prisoner of war and these asylum, and which at the moment is such a heated topic across the Western world, across Europe, across Germany. Yeah. So there was this very, so at this point, I see that. And then this is a model of the wooden mosque. And they had created this very interesting sort of propaganda against the British, which the Germans were sort of promoting, and they were trying to sort of, groom these Muslim soldiers. They also made them make prayers and etc. And so then at some point after this mosque was no more used, and the locals would come and then see it as this sort of monument, it became like a place of going and see. It doesn't exist anymore. But what was interesting, on this land, there was an excavation that was done by the Brandenburg archives. I'm not getting the exact name, but I was very interested to see what they found inside this land. So before they built the facility for refugees and asylum seekers, they actually excavated the ground. And in this ground, they found very interesting objects that somehow are connected and connected to World War One, World War Two, and the Russian occupation. But what was very interesting in all their findings, of course, they found many objects, but they found something like this, which is basically, you see, is like this metal rod. And they suggest that this particular metal rod is of a something that was a chandelier. I don't have the image here, but there was a chandelier inside the mosque. And they say that this could be the 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 sort of the remnants of this particular chandelier. And it's very interesting for me also to look at chandeliers as an object, and I've worked in the past, and it was interesting to observe when I was going and seeing these objects inside this archive. There's countless amounts of image of objects. But I was also told by the archaeologists to be aware that sometimes it's not necessarily that it's connected exactly, because for that we'll have to do forensics and this and that, but it's a suggestion because they were found in that particular level of the ground, etc. So then this became another way to look at the traces, the traces of these soldiers, how in this case under the ground, above in archives. And uh, there was also a currency that was used within the prisoner of war camp. They had their own currency that could not be used outside. So they had created this currency, and this is especially that was used in the prisoner of war camp. I again was very interested to see this particular object, and how was it, what it was, what it must have, what was their function, etc. And yeah, yeah, that's about it. Yeah, I have more, but at this point, I'm just giving you a little entry point into my into my world. Yeah.
I would be happy to have more connections and links in the description next to this video so that people can access more work or reach out to you so we can add that to the text.
Perfect.
When you suggested to talk about the tongue, it was for me kind of like important to highlight the language because in Turkish
Hmm.
the word tongue means language. It's like similar to mother tongue.
Okay.
So that the word language means tongue, so the
Mhm.
literal
Okay.
tongue. And when you said tongue, and I was kind of like imagining that we would talk also about what your oral interpretation or takeaway of your research is. So because you mentioned that there are many languages related to the prisoners,
Yes.
and you don't speak all of them,
Yeah.
but I assume you have a different take on it because still
Yes.
you can relate culturally,
Of
you
course.
can relate some language. So
Of
I would
course.
like to hear how does it feel? I mean, when I went after I realized that there were uh, from New Zealand people in the Aegeis fighting in the First World War.
Yeah.
And then when I visited many years later New Zealand and I saw the memorials and I was like, wow, this is a connection which I personally didn't relate and it was kind of like also interesting because there is a particular day where which is celebrated in Turkey as the Independence Day. But the day before this Independence Day is the day of a loss for the Australians and New Zealanders, and they are not celebrating it, but they are coming extra to Agaze to find their relatives, parents, and so on. So I'm telling that all because it was kind of like these traces which are are still also connections, and I wonder how it is for the Indian society or culture.
So for very interesting because because I come from a country which has got 22 official languages,
Exactly.
list of 22, and then you've got 100 and more, dialects and different indigenous languages, etc. It's really vast. And so what's also very interesting is what you said is there's an element of translation, which is also very, it's a very powerful tool in warfare and in creating in borders, etc. What I can speak, what you can't, what I can understand, what you cannot. And so though even though I depend on the translation for some of the text of the audio, it's coming filtered to somebody's point of view, because you cannot really sometimes translate exactly. You'll have to transcreate it at some point. You'll have to get the nuance. But certain languages have a certain nuance that you will never get. So at some point, yes, I am getting some sort of a filtered, not the first hand point of view, and I have to sort of live with that, and then that also is in a way to understand, and also it talks about the sort of the discrepancies of languages that you will never be able to understand completely, like codes, most, like when in warfare you also have a lot of people signing having codes, and which you can, how can you decipher codes? Even that is, and again, an element of language, numbers, etc. So I do sort of struggle with this fact of I would like to understand this completely. So for example, I was once in a French archives, and I don't speak French very well. I've started to understand a bit, but I know I got some material, and I found this material with a friend who was sitting with me. So I had to go through her. It was through a filter, and she noticed an archive, and she found it very scandalous because of the language and the way it was presented. But I took that same material and I showed it to another friend. And this person said, no, I don't find anything problematic.
Hmm.
And of course, there are political biases over here playing completely. But if I had not checked with this A person and B person and C person, I might just get into a point of view that might be very polarizing,
Hmm.
which is sometimes interesting. But at the same time, it also helps to have a 360 point of view. You cannot go all over the place, but at some point you'll have to stop. So
Hmm.
yes, some of these languages are sort of almost some of them I will never know. Some of them even I've tried to ask people who understand Gurmukhi to get to explain, and this is no, but this is a very some of the language is so dated. The words even I cannot understand it, and this not understanding and this understanding is this kind of which is also very interesting. This sort of these frictions of what can be understood, what cannot. Again, it's though my research sort of embeds itself in very scientific point, it's very scientific in what I'm accessing, but at the same time my interpretations, I think I try to sort of embed them not so scientific, and I try to sort of give it a new space, or give it a new understanding, or try to read between the lines, and one plus, and if he's saying something under certain conditions, these conditions are not documented, and as an artist somehow I'm trying to then bring to light these conditions that might not be seen in the photograph, or might not be seen even though he's written the text, or he's saying something, what is his heart really would like to say. So I'm very interested in these sort of nuances that exist within the archives, that somehow is he really saying it? Am I reading too much? Am I reading not, or what? So that becomes part of the work. And so that's how I access this material. It's frustrating, you're right. I mean, I find it difficult that I'm not able to understand everything, but it's never going to be easy to do that. But at the same time, to sort of pick and see what I can get from what part I've understood, what a part I've not understood. And so, yeah, that's how I sort of approach these discrepancies in languages. And I, again, being in Europe for a while, you have different languages. I go to one part, then where in Belgium there is this whole balance of balance. I'm using a nicer word, I would say, of friction. I want to call it between the Flemish and the French, and the French, and then in Germany and the Netherlands, etc. So it's very interesting to sort of go across these particular languages and keep listening to it. And I, of course, back home in India, I can speak few languages, but then they're not spoken over here. So it's very interesting also for me to see that. Yeah.
I think your work would benefit a lot, or it would make things a bit easier if people who use same perspective approach or same type of, I know it's not minority, but minorities who had who were brought to war and so on
Yeah.
could where you could relate to each other, and
Yes.
therefore I hope this webinar is an invitation to people who have similar interests to trace
Absolutely.
back stuff. So if you are out there, reach out to Baptist. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Baptist, is there anything you would like to particularly highlight or say as the closing words?
Yeah, but I also want to draw a little bit of reference to AI and language, and
Yes, yes,
how
yes,
AI is
please.
being used at this point in time to, track when you have, these asylum seeking centers, etc., and how AI is able to now understand maybe from which part of the world you are, and they kind of, why I'm trying to make this reference is also trying to look at all this whole gamut of, voice archiving from World War I to the present day, and somehow I want to sort of in a way also try and bring them to confront each other, to have a dialogue in some sort of a way, not a way to compare, but it's also to understand how we live today, how it was then, and what were the conditions then and what were the conditions now. So yeah, that is something which I'm very also curious and interested to touch upon in my research and in my artwork. Yeah. Yeah.
So, more invitation to all
Great. Yes.
uh, out there. Thank you very much for being my guest today. I wish you all the best with your research, and I found it
And
very interesting.
yes, and I must not forget to really thank all the partners that have been involved in this particular research, from the Humboldt Forum to the Collaborative Museum to Cost and Tracks, who have been fantastic supporters, to Anna, Magda, and all the fantastic people. I would have not been able to put all this research that I've got through without their help. And it's something which I'm very, very to really stress upon, that sometimes patronage in the arts is so important, patronage in research is so important. And so I'm really, really mindful and grateful for that
Mhm,
particular support, especially for subjects that somehow are not really the subjects that people, it's not like it's not the blockbuster subjects that I want to call that, which are almost shoved under the carpet. So
mhm,
I'm extremely happy to know that there are agencies and there are organizations interested in these kind of
mhm.
research and this kind of subjects which are gone and at the same time have so much of presence even today. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I have to highlight also all the people who are watching this webinar. It's also very important that we as users, as viewers, as audience, check on on research artworks which are different and which is not maybe, as you said, blockbuster or trendy or hot topic or the majority's stories. And
Uh,
so it's also the more interest there is for work which is not the main main topic, the more there is to discover and to understand and to
Absolutely.
compare
Absolutely.
and find dialogues and connecting points.
Yes, because it's also connected in with our present, though one might think it is decades ago or a century ago. It's very connected, very connected to how to understand a mosque in the middle of Berlin in World War I. And I was even told at some point that in today's world there would never be a word called Moshe Strass, but that word exists in
Yeah,
art, and it's still there. It's amazing, and how it's interesting to look at it, and maybe also 100 years going ahead, what did this material would mean,
yeah,
so
yeah.
it's all very relevant, and everything is very, yeah, what is current. Yeah. Yeah.
For me, as someone who grew up in the Austrian society as a migrant kid, uh, for me, it was always surprising to understand that 100 years ago, the perception of Muslim, Oriental, and so on was so much more valued and higher. And then that was kind of like a starting point. Also, the scholars which were coming from Middle East or from India and so on, that they had such a high value, but also because you couldn't produce those colors with the material which was available. In Europe, let's say, or Americas, it doesn't matter. So it was so much more distinct, and it's so much the local names or geographic and had different meanings, and it's for me
Yeah,
also always very very
yeah,
um, changing my repetition what from what I grew up, and that 100 years ago it was not the same, and that in 100 years it will be probably not the same
yes.
neither.
And I think it's all about, yeah, it's sometimes it's so much about referencing and context and, what kind of gaze, how is your point of from what sort of angle you're looking at it. Because as I said, this particular archive I found three or four people giving very different interpretations depending on what they felt the archive was saying. So I somehow was saying, and I did not know understand it at all. And I was depending on them like that, depending on someone is very interesting. This also adds this very interesting trajectory in understanding archives when you do not know the image, when what is it trying to say, this cultural reference of the sari and the silver thing, you would not otherwise notice it until you have seen someone wear a sari. So these are very interesting details that somehow, and it's important to sort of look at them from 360. It's very exhausting because I was really exhausted in the 2 months that I was doing it, and I'm still with names and this and that. But I think that's the beauty, that's the challenge really of the archive, is to not see it like this, but to see it from a 360 view. Yeah, yeah.
Totally agree.
Great.
So, people, if you have interest in those topics, reach out to Baptist. Baptist, thank you very much for being my guest today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this lovely, lovely chat. I think it's interesting to put it out there and and give it an entry point as we were discussing. Yeah, so fantastic. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.